Ezra chapter 2. Well, after Babylon falls to the Medes and Persians, and Cyrus becomes king, you may remember where we left off last week, he makes a proclamation. And in this proclamation, he decrees that the Jews are allowed to leave Babylon and go back to Jerusalem. They were given instructions on what they were to do. They were to go back and reconstruct the temple. And they were to then reestablish their society. Well, as we come into Ezra chapter 2, and I'm going to tell you from the outset, tonight's lesson is probably going to be one of the least interesting of the lessons that we're going to see in this series. But I think that there is enough material here that's going to add to this narrative we've been looking at that will bring some interest to this. But ultimately what we find in Ezra chapter 2 is a long list. A list of individuals and families who traveled back to Jerusalem with the first group of Jews to leave Babylon. Now, a lot of times I have heard people ask questions and make comments wondering, what's the value in a list like this? Is there really anything of value for us as Christians by studying this type of information? I've even heard some preachers make the statement, well, these lists in the Old Testament, they meant something to the Jews, but they really don't mean anything to us today. Well, folks, I beg to differ. There are many things that we can learn from lists, like what we see in Ezra chapter 2. And tonight, we're going to notice some of those lessons. Now, we're not going to go through and do a verse-by-verse study of this chapter. I am not going to attempt to pronounce all of these names or these places, but we are going to talk about these different groupings that we find and some of the lessons that we can see that contributed to why these were the first individuals that made the choice to leave Babylon and go back to Jerusalem. Just kind of for your reference, if you want to jot this down, we also find a parallel account of this first group's leaving in the book of Nehemiah chapter 7, verses 6 through 73. And so if you ever want to turn over and look at that, that is a parallel account of what we're going to see here in Ezra chapter 2. Well, Ezra chapter 2 and verse 2 is generally considered to be a list of the leaders of this initial group. We know that Zerubbabel was the man who was chosen to be the main leader of this first group of Jews to leave. Haggai chapter 2 and verse 2 tells us that Zerubbabel was already a man of some prominence. He was a man who had served as a governor over the land of Judah prior to any of these Jews leaving to go back. And so he already held a diplomatic position. He was already seen as a leader. But another interesting thing about Zerubbabel, we find that he was a man who would be an ancestor of Jesus. For he is listed in both of the genealogies of Jesus that we find in Matthew 1, 12 and 13, and also Luke 3 and verse 27. But then it goes on to list some other names. Jeshua, Nehemiah, Sariah, Reliah, Mordecai, Bilshan, Mizpar, Bigvai, Rehum, and Baanah. And it's generally believed that these were men who were placed in charge of smaller groups. They would have been assigned a certain number of these returning Jews that they would have been the leaders over that specific group, but serving ultimately under the leadership of Zerubbabel. But then we come down into really the meat of this list. And in verses 3 through 35, we find a listing by number of how many people from each hometown returned back to Judah. And as we go through this list, we see some familiar names. For example, verse 21, we read about people from Bethlehem who returned back. Verse 28, we read about people from Bethel and Ai who returned. From Nebo in verse 29 and from Jericho in verse 34. So these are some familiar names, familiar places that these families had initially settled. Then when they went into captivity and then were allowed to come back, they went back and they settled back where they came from. They went back to their hometowns. Now, in this list, we're not told the names of all of these individuals. It would take a much more lengthy discourse in order to do that. We're not even really told all of the family names of the people from these places, but merely the cities and the number of people from each city that returned. Then in verses 36 through 39, we find listed the number of people from each of 4 priestly families that returned from Babylon. These were the families of Jeshua, Immer, Pashur, and Haram. Now these families would have all descended from Levi, and they would have served in various priestly functions, including carrying out the services and the rituals and the sacrifices that would be offered as a part of their worship under the old law. Now, when we look at that list, we find that there were 4,287 priests that left Babylon during this first return. Do you have any guess or any idea as to why there would have been so many priests that would have left initially? One estimate said that about 10% of this first group was made up of priests. Well, what was the main task that this first group was to fulfill?
Wasn't it to bring them, when they got back there, to establish the religion?
To rebuild the temple and to reestablish the worship of God.
Yes.
And so, really, the priests, they were the ones who had the most to gain from getting back to Judah. Because for so long, they had not had access to the temple. They hadn't been able to carry out many of the rituals and things that required that location. And so, to use a more colloquial term, they were chomping at the bit to get back. They were excited. They wanted to get back and get the worship of God reestablished. And so you had a large number of priests who came back seeking to get the temple rebuilt and to restore the worship of God. But then we see something that I find interesting, and you might not. But if you look at verse 40, notice how few Levites returned. We find that there were only about 40 that returned back. Now, something that is important for us to remember, not every man from the tribe of Levi served as a priest. There were only certain family units within the tribe of Levi that were granted the right to serve as priests. Other Levite men served other tasks, generally in assistance of the priests. And so they would serve a lot of times more of the physical tasks that had to be carried out around the temple. And the priests would see to the fulfillment of the spiritual requirements that would take place. And I misspoke, I said 40, but there were only about 74 Levites that returned. You had over 4,000 priests, but only 74 Levites. Now, when I read this, it made me wonder why that would be. Well, it is commonly believed that while the Jews were in Babylonian captivity, they didn't have all of the works that had to be done that the Levites generally would carry out. And so the temple wasn't there. They didn't have the work that they would do assisting the priests. And so many Levite men had engaged in other forms of work. And so now you have, in some cases, 3 or 4 generations of Levite families that have never served as a Levite servant, have never served the priests in that way. And so what we're going to find as we go along, especially further into Ezra and Nehemiah, it's going to get to a point where this lack of Levites is going to pose a problem. Because there's going to be tasks that need to be fulfilled around the temple, and there's not going to be anybody there that has the right and the authority to do it. Because ultimately, this role of Levites had been phased out over time. And so there weren't that many Levites left at the time when they returned to Jerusalem. Well, then in Ezra 2 and verse 41, it gives a number of singers who returned. Well, once again, you remember what they're doing. They're going back to get worship reestablished in the temple. They want everything in place, ready to go, so that when everybody else gets there, they don't have to try to figure everything out at that point. And so they are in the process of trying to get everyone and everything back that they need in order to accomplish reestablishing worship in the temple. And so they take back singers. They take back musicians. These 128 singers would have been involved in worship at the temple. We know that David was the one who initially planned out the role that the singers would play there in 1 Chronicles chapter 25. But there were other individuals and other types of roles that were needed as well. Because you notice you go on further down in this list, and verse 42 talks about the number of gatekeepers who came back. Well, these men would have been responsible for guarding each of the entrances of the temple and only allowing those individuals either that had the authority to enter the temple or those who had been through ritual cleansing to enter the temple. The job of a gatekeeper was to keep the temple pure. No one that was unclean, no one who did not have authority was allowed to enter into that place. And these individuals, once again, David was the one that created this position. 1 Chronicles 26, verses 1 through 19. But then we find another group. In Ezra chapter 2, verses 43 through 54, it gives a number of what most translations will simply refer to them as the Nethinims. The Nethinims. These were temple servants. These were individuals that their sole job was to take care of the needs of the temple. Usually, these were the assistants of the Levites. Now remember, I said the Levites were the assistants of who? Of the priests. So now you have the assistants of the assistants. So basically, the Levites did what the priests didn't want to do. The Nethinim did what the Levites didn't want to do. And so as you move on down the line, you're going to find these individuals, they're going to take on more menial tasks. Their jobs are going to be one that's not going to be as public and prominent. They're going to be carrying out more of the hard, laborious work that would have to take place. But then as we come down into verses 55 through 58, we find an even lesser group of servants. Because what we find here are ones who hold the significance of being descendants of men who had served with King Solomon. So they're able to look back in their lineage and they are able to trace their lineage back to a slave who at some point had served within the court or within the structure of the monarchy of King Solomon. Now, most Jewish historians believe that these were not people of Israelite descent. They believe that these were people who had been conquered by Solomon. These were heathen nations who had come in but had become trusted servants. And so as a result of that, no, they didn't have the same rights that an Israelite would have, but they were allowed to live and function within that culture, and they were allowed to serve these Israelites in various ways. Most people believe that these servants' main task would have been the actual construction of the temple, the walls, and any of the actual physical labor that was necessary to construct the temple. These would have been your stonemasons. These would have been the goldsmiths. These would have been the ones who would have actually been carrying out much of that labor. Because, you stop and you look at what we've seen. A lot of the ones that have come back were not people who were trained in how to do that kind of work. You had people who were priests, people who were Levites, people whose main roles were doing things of a spiritual nature. And so they had to have people along who knew how to do construction, who knew how to actually carry out those physical tasks. And most Jewish historians believe that this group, and some even take it so far as to say, where it talks about those who had served King Solomon, that they are descendants of men who had actually initially constructed the temple for Solomon. And so you may remember back in olden times, trades generally moved down through a family. Whatever your father's trade was, that's what your trade was going to be. And so you would have stonemasons who would pass that down to their children. And so once again, Jewish history says, some of these individuals were ones who could trace their craft back to those who had initially constructed the temple. And so simply by having that in and out knowledge of what had taken place was something that made these individuals quite valuable. Any questions or comments up to this point? All right, then in verses 59 through 63, we find lists of individuals who came from certain regions, but for some reason they were not able to trace their family lineage. To a Jew, was that something major? Yes. To the Jews, everything depended upon their lineage. Everything depended upon which tribe they descended from, where they were going to settle, where their land was going to be, what their roles were going to be considered within the kingdom. So many things came down to, I descended from such and such tribe. But for some reason now you have some individuals who know that they're Jews, they know they're of Jewish descent, but for some reason down through the periods of time, they've lost track of their history. They've lost track of that genealogy. Now, there's some different ideas out there. I really don't ascribe to them because to me it doesn't make logical sense. Some are saying, no, these weren't really Jews, but these were Gentile proselytes. Well, that really wouldn't matter because with the Gentile proselytes, their lineage never mattered anyway. And so it wouldn't have mattered in this instance as well. Others make the argument that these were individuals who, for one reason or another, had been outcast from their family units. And so down through the generations, they continued to function in Jewish society, but they were never allowed to be a part of their family units. Therefore, they lost track of exactly what their lineage was. Others look at it and say, no, these were half-breeds. Half Jew, half Gentile. Therefore, by that unscriptural mixed relationship that would have taken place, they lost their lineage. To me, I think it is most logical for us to simply look at these individuals as people who, for one reason or another, simply lost track of their family. I don't think there's anything in the text that indicates that it was because of some type of sin or being outcast or that they were heathens in some way. These are merely people who don't know their family. And I think that there are probably some of us here tonight who could say that there's certain branches of our family tree that we really don't know that much about. for one reason or another. It's not because necessarily anything wrong happened, but sometimes people simply lose track. Well, here's where it gets interesting. Those who found themselves in this predicament of not knowing what their hometown was supposed to be, not knowing what family units they were supposed to be living around, they were told that they were basically kind of in limbo. They were in a holding pattern. They weren't allowed to join in with any of these other family units. But they were told that they were to wait until they got back to Jerusalem, and then they were to inquire through the Urim and the Thummim. Now, it is not exactly known what these two things were 100%. We know that they were tools that were used by the high priest. We know that they had certain predictive qualities, as we're able to see in the Scriptures. According to Exodus 28 and verse 30 and also Leviticus 8 and verse 8, these were objects that were to be worn upon the breastplate of the high priest. They were required objects, a part of his vestments. But Numbers 27 and verse 21 says that the high priest was able to use these objects to communicate with God. He was able to go to God, but the thing that's interesting about this, it never talks about this being necessarily a two-way conversation. It always says that these things were used to inquire of God, to ask questions of God. You may remember in 1 Samuel 14, verses 36 through 42, and also chapter 23, verses 1 through 12, that both David and Saul, during their reigns, had the high priest use the Urim and the Thummim to inquire of God about various things during their reign. But then you may also remember that at the end of Saul's reign, he goes to the high priest again, and he wants the high priest to go to God again and inquire of God once again. And this time, God tells him no. It's not going to work this time. Saul had fallen out of God's grace, and so he didn't have access to this. Many Jewish scholars believe that the Urim and the Thummim was one of three ways that God communicated with man during the time of the law of Moses. They often look at 1 Samuel chapter 28 and verse 6. And in this, it lists dreams, the Urim, and the prophets. Now, these came to be known among Jews as the dream oracle, the Urim oracle, and the oracle of the prophets. Now, we certainly see evidence in the Old Testament of God communicating with people through dreams. You can shake your head, yes. Do we also, in the Old Testament, see evidence of God communicating with people through prophets? Yes. But where the Urim and the Thummim, and I may not be pronouncing that exactly right, but where that comes in, it's generally described by Jewish historians as a specially marked stone. And this stone would have different markings on each side of this stone. And depending upon which historian you're reading, some say that it would be cast into the air, kind of like we would flip a coin. And while it was in the air, God would somehow manipulate that stone, and however that stone would land, it would be either yes or no, and that God was the one who had manipulated that. Others explain it that the high priest would take and hold the stone in his hand, would pray to God, and then he would open his hand, and whatever side of that stone was facing up, whether it was yes or no, was indicative of God's answer. Well, we know from numerous passages of Scripture that somehow this tool was used by the high priest to get answers from God to certain questions. Exactly how it was used, like I said, it's up to speculation. There's no one that really knows exactly how it was used. But something that I find very interesting is after the death of David, we never see this item used again. It's mentioned, but we never see a priest seeking to communicate with God using this item again after the death of David. Many Jews believe that the reason for that is because God slowly changed to where he communicated his messages mainly through the prophets rather than through the high priest. As the high priest became more corrupt, God had to have godly individuals to come and communicate his will. And so rather than have a corrupt priest using this somewhat miraculous form of communicating God's will, it kind of fell out of use, and the priests became the main source of God's communication to man. But then the question arises, why were these individuals who had lost their lineage, if this had fallen out of use centuries before, why were they told, wait till you get back to Jerusalem and you get the priesthood reestablished and then use this to inquire of God? That's a good question, isn't it? Well, most people believe that those objects either would have been destroyed or would have been carried away as a spoil of battle during the fall of Judah to Babylon. Others say that quite possibly, like the book of the law had been hidden, that possibly these objects as well had been hidden. And that these Jews were anticipating being able to go back and to restore every single aspect of Old Testament worship. But there is never anything in the Scriptures or in the historic record that ever says these objects were ever found, they were ever utilized, or these individuals ever had an opportunity to inquire of God by way of the high priest using these objects. And so most people believe that it was superstition. That Zerubbabel and these other leaders, they did not want to possibly run the risk of doing something that would anger God and allow these people that had no clue of their family heritage to, possess land or engage in business that they didn't have a right to engage in. And so they were grasping at straws, trying to find some way that they could possibly explain a way of finding an answer for this. But more than likely, these individuals continued on throughout life, being excluded from the benefits of being Israelites. Because nothing is ever indicated that tells us that they ever found out their family heritage, that they were ever allowed to go back into the full fellowship of the Israelites. Well, then we come to Ezra 2, verses 64 through 67. We find the total number of people and the total number of animals that came back during this first group. There were 42,360 Jews, 7,367 male and female servants, which more than likely these would have been individuals who were not Israelites, who were not of Hebrew descent. These more than likely would have been either proselytes or those who were of other conquered nations that wanted to go back and serve as servants. You had the 200 Levite singers for a total of just under 50,000 people. If my math is correct, 49,927 people. They leave in this first wave to head back to Jerusalem. But we also find a record of how many animals went back with them. Listen to this. 736 horses, 245 mules, 435 camels, and 6,720 donkeys. The reason why there were so many donkeys is because donkeys were of lesser value. Most families were able to afford a donkey. They were considered the main work animal for a common family. But then when you got into camels and mules and horses, those were seen as signs of wealth. And so we see that there were some individuals who left who did have some indications of the wealth that they had attained while they were there, because they were able to have certain forms of livestock that generally was only available to those who were wealthy. But one thing that we can see from this list, most of the people who returned in this first wave were not the elite Jews. Most were not wealthy. Because you look, the lowliest of animal was the one that there was the most of. These would have been animals that the common man, the common Jew, would have been taking back with him. Okay, so we'll stop right there and then have just a couple of additional things that I want to mention from this chapter next week, and then we'll move on into our next topic going on down the line.